In this day of cutbacks and everything, we have to show our economic contribution and quantify things. Some people don't agree with that approach, but I'd be a pragmatist and say, well, we have to put a value to the services that are being provided.
Some of the older traditionalists think the evaluation is it's a commodification.
It is.
But I think, as you said, it's something that needs to be done.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, that is exactly the case. I mean, you are treating it as a commodity, and of course there is intrinsic value in it in its own right. They're not mutually exclusive. I think you can value it. You should enjoy biodiversity, and you should be able to do that. But we live in a society, whether we like it or not, where we have to be pragmatic and we have to actually fight for conservation. And in Ireland, primarily since 1970, but even before that, we have had profound changes in the Irish countryside, really profound ones. And they've had profound changes and impacts on biodiversity. And we're at the stage now where we don't have the luxury, to be honest, to just seeing it for its intrinsic value and saying, I enjoy walking and enjoying it because it's disappearing as we're here. So there has to be a situation. We have to try something new. We've got no choice. I suspect that's one of the main changes that happened in 1990 with this Convention on Biological Diversity. It actually recognised that the kind of traditionalist approach, and I don't mean that's in a derogatory way, but let's say the conventional traditional approach where you try to create nature reserves and try to keep nature separate from our activity, it just wasn't working. We really had no choice but to try something different. So biodiversity is much more dynamic, and it's actually saying, rolling up your sleeves and getting in with the sectors, business communities, getting in with some of the other sectors and saying, well, how can we communicate? How can we engage with your sector to make sure that we can benefit biodiversity? So one of my fears is, though, that particularly with the arguments with tourism, I mean, people, certainly Ireland, the Irish landscape is beautiful and it is an asset in its own right, and people will come and should be encouraged to come to Ireland to experience the landscape. But I think we need to be careful that it's not hijacked, because people come to see mountains and they come to see scenery level, and they come to see with large components of the landscape. But whether that hillside is lush green, which looks very attractive, full of monoculture of perennial ryegrass, or whether it's diverse, species-rich grassland, I think doesn't really make any huge difference to the bulk of tourism. Right. But of course, from a biodiversity point of view, the latter is what we need to sustain.
That's a point well taken. Thank you. Yeah. Liam, in general terms, how does Ireland's biodiversity compare with other EU member states?
Well, biodiversity, there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. People say, well, we have no biodiversity hotspots in Ireland. All the biodiversity hotspots areas are along the equator and the tropical rainforests. We don't, in terms of quantity, we don't have a huge number of species. So in that sense, we don't have a very diverse biodiversity, just purely in terms of numbers. However, because we've been an island for a long time, we have elements within our biodiversity which are unique to Ireland. So it's not the quantity game, but it's the quality game. And some of we have some unique subspecies to Ireland, and we have assemblages of how species interact in Ireland, which would be different to interacting anywhere else on the globe, really. So the key thing about the biodiversity in Ireland, it's unique, it's our own one, it's special in that regard. And what the conditions under which this biodiversity operates within Ireland can't be replicated anywhere else. So it's the uniqueness of it that we have to articulate and to flag.
Well, that actually leads us into a whole area that I think you and I both have an interest in, how do you talk about biodiversity in a way that engages people in it so that they really appreciate it and maybe commit to it or get involved with it? You're competing with climate change, which is dominating any conversation on environmental issues. We know biodiversity and climate change is certainly closely related. Yeah. But as you said earlier, climate change has a polar bear, and biodiversity doesn't have that poster child yet. And trying to use an invertebrate as a poster child is kind of hard sell. How do you sell it?
Well, I wouldn't, is the short answer. I wouldn't use the invertebrate. One of the gaps I think we have in Ireland is some articulation of where we want to be, let's say, in 10 years' time in terms of conservation. What are we working towards? And that is, agriculture had that, for example, when they wanted to increase productivity in the 70s and 80s. They had this model that they were all trying to achieve, and they could buy into that. We need something similar in the biodiversity. Mentioned, there is a latent interest in the environment amongst the general population, but for whatever reason, I don't know, it's how we communicate or not as conservationists, we tend, not only do we not engage with them, but we tend to alienate them. And I think communication has to be a big thing that we do. We have to try to understand what are key messages we want to get across, and you know, be quite strategic in what we want to do. One of the biggest challenges, we mentioned this goods and services, the contribution biodiversity makes to us is so profound and so basic that it's actually hard. It's a hidden service, but it's hard to articulate. How do we get people to appreciate that what they think is free and they take for granted, to put a value on that? Now, I've no answers. I think that cuts across all aspects of society. Actually, those things that are free and we do tend to take for granted. Again, like any business, they identify what their goals are. They identify a key target audience, and they get professional help or, you know, their skill to deliver that. I think one of the weaknesses that we have, the people who are interested in conservation usually are either the research community or people who have an interest in science. They're usually not skilled, or they don't have the skill sets that's needed to actually communicate.
Yes.
To a target audience. How do you communicate? How do you identify your target audience? You know, the strategy at that level. So it's the kind of strategic framework for conservation in Ireland which we need to start putting in place. And it's hard to know who will take the lead on that.
Liam, thanks very much for talking to us.
Thank you very much, Bob.
Thanks.